Having explored the historical backdrop of Pyrrhonism, we now zero in on a specific concept that seems to have sparked considerable debate within its lineage: the very idea of a sign. We're not just looking at Sextus Empiricus here, though he's our main window. We're tracing how this notion was handled from the early days, perhaps even before Aeneasidemus, right through to Sextus. The big question is, did the Pyrrhonian take on signs stay constant, or did it evolve significantly? So, where do we start? Well, if you look back at the absolute beginning with Pyrrho himself and his immediate followers, there's a curious silence. No one's really talking about signs in the way we might expect. Now, don't get me wrong, the topic wasn't entirely foreign. Thinkers like Zeno of Citium had written specifically on signs, Aristotle had some thoughts on them, and the whole idea of using evidence to draw conclusions goes way back. So, chronologically, it's not impossible they'd have weighed in. But here's the kicker. The early Pyrrhonists, as Timon paints them, weren't really into theoretical sparring matches. Pyrrho's whole vibe, according to Timon, was about inner peace, ataraxia, achieved by stepping away from philosophical arguments altogether. It wasn't about winning debates, it was about achieving tranquility. Timon himself might have been a bit of an exception, apparently writing critiques, but even those might not have been detailed arguments like Sextus later produced. Given this deliberate withdrawal, it's hardly surprising they didn't dive deep into dissecting signs. Their focus was elsewhere. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and the scene changes dramatically. Enter Aeneasidemus. He's the guy who really gets the ball rolling for what we call later Pyrrhonism. And unlike his predecessors Aeneasidemus, he loves a good debate. Our main source here is Photius, the 9th century patriarch, who gives us a summary of Aeneasidemus's 8-book work, the Pyrrhonist Discourses. Book 1 lays out the general Pyrrhonian view, which Photius spends most time on. But the other 7 books, they tackle specific topics, and crucially, they involve criticizing non-Pyrrhonian views. And guess what? Book 4, dedicated entirely to the topic of signs. Suddenly, signs are front and center in the Pyrrhonian agenda. Now, what does Photius tell us Aeneasidemus actually said about these signs? This is where things get interesting. Photius reports that Aeneasidemus asserted that signs, meaning things that are clear signs of things that are unclear, simply do not exist at all. Ut holes eini. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? Not just skeptical questioning, but outright denial. And he apparently dismissed anyone believing otherwise as being deceived by a vain attraction. Wow. But then, Photius adds another layer. Aeneasidemus also stirred up the customary series of difficulties about nature, the cosmos, the gods, insisting none of these fall within our apprehension. Now, the translation of that phrase tas ekthos effexes aporias is key. If effexes is taken as a simple connective like next, it looks like 2 separate topics. But the better reading, as scholars like Henry and Inwood Gerson suggest, keeps effexes within the phrase, meaning the customary series of difficulties. This implies these aren't just tacked on after discussing signs. They're part of the same discussion, presented as related aspects. This connection is vital. Okay, so Aeneasidemus denying the existence of signs throws us a curveball, doesn't it? Especially when we compare him to Sextus Empiricus. For Sextus, the whole point of skeptical arguments is epache, suspending judgment. You argue against something to balance the arguments for it, leaving the reader hanging, undecided. But Aeneasidemus? He seems to be aiming for a definite conclusion. Signs don't exist. Furthermore, Sextus famously distinguishes between 2 types of signs: indicative signs, which he targets with his critique, and commemorative signs, which he readily accepts as part of everyday life and even useful for the skeptic. Think smoke as a sign of fire that's commemorative. But Aeneasidemus seems to reject all signs. So, what gives? Did Aeneasidemus fundamentally disagree with the later tradition? Or did the Pyrrhonian view itself shift over time? That's the puzzle we need to unravel. So how do we reconcile Aeneasidemus' seemingly radical denial? Could Photius have misunderstood him? Maybe, but Photius is generally considered a reliable reporter, especially given the nuance in his summary of Aeneasidemus' general outlook. Plus, this isn't an isolated incident. Photius mentions Aeneasidemus attacking causal theories and denying the existence of causes, and also denying the existence of the ethical end. It starts looking like a pattern. And Diogenes Laertius, another compiler, echoes this, reporting Pyrrhonists denying the existence of signs, motion, coming to be, the good and bad, causes, learning. He even says they do away with things like the criterion and learning. Again, this sounds like outright rejection. Then consider Sextus himself. In his Against the Ethicists, a work that feels closer to Anaximenes' style, Sextus argues definitively that nothing is naturally good or bad. This isn't about suspension, it's presented as essential for achieving ataraxia. This provides powerful confirmation. Yes, there was indeed a phase in Pyrrhonism likely associated with Anaximenes, where denying the existence of certain entities was a standard tactic. So Anaximenes probably did mean what he said. Let's revisit that link Photius highlighted between Anaximenes' denial of signs and his skepticism about apprehending the nature of things. What exactly was this apprehension, catalepsis? Photius notes the Pyrrhonists avoided making unambiguous statements about things. Why? Because, traditionally, a thing's true nature was thought to consist precisely in those features it possesses unambiguously, universally. So, refusing unambiguous statements suggests a refusal to claim knowledge of true nature. Furthermore, Anaximenes insisted that catalepsis itself was beyond our reach. Putting these together, it seems Anaximenes conceived of catalepsis as a kind of superior knowledge, the ability to grasp the real unchanging nature of things. Since we can't achieve this, we shouldn't make unqualified claims. Now, if signs are supposed to be the tools we use to investigate and discover this underlying nature, and if Anaximenes believed we couldn't truly apprehend nature, it follows logically that he would target the very tools used for such investigation. His denial of signs likely stems from this deeper skepticism about our ability to know the real nature of reality. Sextus actually quotes an argument Anaximenes supposedly used in his fourth book. Let's break it down. The structure is classic logic. 1. Premise 1. Apparent things appear the same to similarly disposed observers. Think whiteness, everyone sees it as white. 2. Premise 2. Signs are apparent things. 3. Therefore, intermediate conclusion. Signs should appear the same to similarly disposed observers. 4. Premise 3. The challenge. But signs do not appear the same. Doctors disagree on what symptoms mean. 5. Therefore, conclusion. Signs are not apparent things. Sextus clarifies premise 3. It means different experts see the same sign, say flushed face, as indicating different underlying conditions. Contrast this with whiteness. Its appearance is uniform and uncontroversial. The argument hinges on the idea that if signs were truly apparent, their meaning would be as directly observable and uncontroversial as whiteness. Since disagreement exists, they fail this test of being apparent things. But here's where James Allen points out a crucial subtlety. This argument relies on an unstated assumption. What is it? It's the assumption that for a sign to qualify as an apparent thing, its entire signifying function, what it signifies and why it signifies it, must be immediately apparent in perception. In other words, seeing the sign should automatically reveal its meaning. Allen calls this the idea that their semiotic content must be part of their phenomenal content. Think about it. When you see a flushed face, the redness is apparent. But is the meaning that it signifies illness or health or anger equally apparent? No, that requires interpretation, inference, medical expertise. The disagreement among doctors precisely shows this. If Anaximenes operated under the assumption that signs must reveal their full meaning instantly, like whiteness reveals its color, then the fact that doctors disagree about the meaning of a symptom does indeed support the conclusion that signs aren't truly apparent things. This assumption makes his argument seem quite compelling, leading towards the denial of signs altogether. So, let's put the pieces together. Anaximenes seems to attack signs primarily because they supposedly lead us astray from grasping the true nature of things, and because he assumes their meaning must be directly visible, like whiteness. Now, let's look at how Sextus characterizes the type of sign Anaximenes seems to be targeting: the indicative sign. Sextus says indicative signs are used to discover things that are naturally non-evident, things hidden by their very nature. They signify by means of their own nature and constitution, almost as if they speak directly. He even says they signify all but giving voice. Does this sound familiar? It perfectly matches the assumptions we found in Anaximenes' argument. Signs that reveal underlying nature, signs whose meaning is inherent in their observable properties. These are exactly the indicative signs Sextus defines. Commemorative signs, like smoke for fire, rely on memory and past association, not on revealing hidden nature or speaking directly. They don't fit Anaximenes' criteria. So, perhaps the real difference between Anaximenes and Sextus isn't a fundamental shift in skepticism, but rather a change in how they define the category of sign. Anaximenes focused narrowly on the indicative type, while Sextus later broadened the definition to include commemorative signs. To really hammer home this distinction, Let's contrast the commemorative sign with what Aeneasidemus likely meant by sign. As Sextus explains, commemorative signs work through recollection. You see smoke, and because you remember seeing smoke with fire many times before, you infer fire is present. Crucially, the signifying power here comes from past experience, from association, not from anything inherent in the smoke itself. Smoke doesn't possess fireness. It reminds you of fire because of your history of observing them together. Even conventional signs, like a bell signaling dinner, derive their meaning purely from social agreement, not from any intrinsic property. This reliance on recollection and external correlation, this lack of inherent signifying power, is the exact opposite of what Aeneasidemus seems to assume about signs. Commemorative signs in Sextus' terms wouldn't even qualify as signs in Aeneasidemus' stricter sense. Now, adopting any kind of sign, even commemorative ones, still raises a red flag for the skeptic. Aren't we slipping back into dogmatism? Isn't using signs just another form of reasoning, albeit perhaps simpler? Sextus insists he's not doing that. His defense rests on framing commemorative signs not as logical inference, but as a causal process involving memory. Seeing smoke triggers a pre-existing association formed by past observations of smoke and fire. It's like how seeing Paris might remind you of a friend you met there. It's a non-inferential recall. To emphasize this, Sextus uses the word enenusthai, to renew, suggesting we're reactivating existing knowledge, not forming new conclusions. He calls it a sort of observational consequence, highlighting that awareness arises from observation, not from a logical step following from a premise. This process aligns perfectly with the Pyrrhonian ideal of living according to the observance of ordinary life, Beati Teresis, trusting our ingrained responses and associations rather than abstract reasoning. Before wrapping up, let's quickly touch on a textual point. Which of Sextus's works discussing signs came first? The usual assumption is that the Outlines of Pyrrhonism PH is the earlier, more foundational text, and Against the Logicians M is a later, expanded version. However, scholars like Philipson and Ebert have pointed out that the discussion of signs in Against the Logicians actually seems rougher, less polished than the one in the Outlines. This suggests the opposite, that Against the Logicians might be the original, and the Outlines a revision. Another piece of evidence comes from Diogenes Laertius. Both Sextus and Diogenes often draw on the same underlying sources. Interestingly, the version of the sign argument in Against the Logicians is far closer to the Diogenes summary than the version in the Outlines is. This strongly suggests that Against the Logicians preserved the original source material more faithfully, while the Outlines represents a later adaptation or refinement. Similar patterns appear in Sextus' ethical writings. Taken together, these points provide a compelling case for reversing the conventional order. Against the Logicians likely preceded the Outlines. So, to wrap this up, we've seen a fascinating evolution in how the Pyrrhonian tradition handled the concept of signs. Starting with Aeneasidemus, the focus seems to have been on denying the existence of a specific type of sign, the one that claims to reveal hidden truths, the indicative sign. This denial was tied to a deep skepticism about our ability to grasp the true nature of reality. Later with Sextus, we see a shift. While still critical of the idea of signs revealing underlying nature, Sextus incorporates commemorative signs, the ones based on memory and convention, into the skeptical toolkit, arguing they are acceptable for practical life. This represents a broader understanding of what counts as a sign and a strategic adaptation of the tradition. It really highlights that Pyrrhonism wasn't a static doctrine, but a living tradition that developed and refined its ideas over time.